and the slogan كل يوم عاشوراء كل أرض كربلاء, that became a very common slogan inside the liberation struggle in South Africa for Muslims and for others. I served as National Commissioner for Gender Equality, and I was appointed by President Mandela. I'm an addict of Dua Kemil. The Dua Kemil is a strange thing for me. You promised me this, and now you see I'm in a mess, and the flames are all around me. And I had affirmed your unity. وأنا عبدك. You can hear me crying. Why aren't you doing anything? The large trend of contemporary tasawwuf, especially in the West, it has little to do with the spirit of tasawwuf in early Islam. Their zuhd wasn't only a zuhd in order to cleanse their hearts of materiality, but the zuhd was also a part of identification with the people who don't have.
علامة طباطبائي about Iman, where he says the light of Iman radiates gradually upon the heart, and this continues intensely until it reaches perfection. Iman then continues to increase and grows firm until it reaches to the stage of certitude, which is yaqeen.
A person with a fake label can exude a wonderful personality and good akhlaq and can be a good believer. And a person with a genuine label can be the most corrupt person on the face of the earth. I'm busy writing a chapter at the moment on Zionism and the colonization of God. And this is really when you reduce God to your national entity, your country's mascot. The one book that I will recommend is Ízotsu's Ethico-Religious Concepts in the Quran. And the other book that I would recommend is Michael Seltz's Towards Understanding the Quran. The Quran's words don't only contain meaning. The talaffuz, the expression, the tilawat, also carries meaning. How does the Quran speak to your heart? It's a life of submission. And it's a life of struggling with our Iman, struggling to increase it, struggling to preserve it. If you privilege the ethical religio identity of people, then the sociological label is inconsequential. So you can't praise the Muslims for what was done by Muhammad and his ummah when we resemble nothing of that sort. And you can't blame the Jews for what was done in the time of the Prophet. Look, the general pattern amongst our ulama, mal asaf, has been to gradually narrow the meaning of who is us, and to gradually broaden the boundaries of who is not us. We are meant to compete with each other in good deeds, and God will inform us about whose deeds were the better, and God will inform us about who was ahaq, who was closer to the truth.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة. In this interview, we are interviewing Professor Farid Ishaq from South Africa. Professor Ishaq is currently a professor at the Department of Religion Studies at Johannesburg University in South Africa. He holds a PhD from the University of Birmingham in England and pursued postdoctoral studies in biblical hermeneutics at the St. Georgian Graduate School of Philosophy and Theology at Frankfurt, Germany. Professor Ishaq is a South African Muslim liberation theologian. He studied in Pakistan, UK, Germany, and he also studied traditional Islamic studies in his country in Madrasa Nizami. He's the author of the interesting book, Quran, Liberation, and Pluralism. Another book also on being a Muslim, an introduction to the Quran. He's also interested in Quranic humanities. So Sheikh Farid, Dr. Farid, Assalamu alaikum. It's an honor having you with us today.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And it's certainly an honor for me to be your guest, Hadi.
Thank you very much. So today we'll talk about redefining Islam and Kufr towards a universal understanding of Quran. There is a deep theory of religious pluralism and diversity in Quran, where you presented according to different scholars such as Tabatabai, Rashid Rida, Ízótso, and Ibn Arabi's thoughts. We'll delve into some of the interesting topics. But in the beginning, tell us more about your life from childhood, why you chose this field of religion, Quran, philosophical studies, and give us a summary of your intellectual, spiritual, academic path, maybe some teachers that affected your life or some incidences that you feel too much important, and your main interest in pluralism and liberation, which manifested in the book I mentioned.
Okay, I will try to be brief, but عندما سئلني في بداية المدرسة أو في الابتدائية ماذا تريد يعني أن تكون عندما when you grow up, you become an adult, what do you want to be? So I said there were two things I wanted to do, either one or the other. The first one is I wanted to sell ice cream. The second one is I wanted to become a scholar of Islam. But then I quickly figured out that the ice cream does not actually belong to the guy who sells the ice cream. He sells the ice cream on behalf of another person. So I thought that if I become an ice cream seller, I would be able to eat all the ice cream in the world that I wanted to. And of course, after the Israeli, after the Ben and Jerry boycott of the occupied territories, my preference by now would probably have been for Ben and Jerry ice cream. So now that I couldn't sell an ice cream, knowing that I'm not going to be able to eat them all for free, I decided to become a religious scholar. And at that time, I was 6 or 7 years old. So boring as it may have sounded, this is a path that both I have chosen and has been chosen for me. And alhamdulillah, I'm deeply grateful for the fact that I am able to earn an income from something that gives me such happiness and provides food on the table and is an immense source of joy for me. I am as happy with the study of Islam and the study of religion as I was since I have been a child. And my childhood took me through, I grew up in a Sunni community, and my childhood took me through the Tablighi Jamaat. I ended up in a Deobandi Salafi Darul Uloom in Karachi. Actually, I was in 2 Darul Ulooms in Karachi for a period of 8 years and did all the typical things that one studies in a Hawza. My Darul Uloom was a fiercely anti-Shia Darul Uloom. Some of the big ulama of the Sunnis who had written the standing anti-Shia books that are still being read all over the world today were written by the ulama and the asatida of that Darul Uloom. There were some very funny stories. I mean, like, one of my respected asatiza, Maulana Badi Zaman Marhum, the story of the Ahlul Bayt attitude towards the Quran, and is the Quran Kalamullah or not. So he said that the Barelvis, that the Shias, they believe that that 1/4 of the Quran is missing because Sayyidina Aisha's goat her goat, you know, this bakara. This goat had eaten the 10 ajza up. So I asked, oh, that must have been an exceptionally intelligent goat to stop at exactly the 10th juz and stop eating and then left the 30 juz for us. Nobody in the class thought it was funny at all. In fact, they were very angry at me. But this is what their logic was taking them to. I wasn't being funny. I was. But I was also following your logic. على أي حال استفدت كثير من الدراسة بينهم الحمد لله. I really benefited a lot. And I graduated after 8 years, and then I returned to South Africa. And in South Africa at that time, it was the time of, well, the Islamic Revolution in Iran had started early in that 8 years when I was there. I think it started in 73, just as I arrived in Karachi. And then in 1976, there was a huge uprising in South Africa. So when I returned to South Africa after 8 years, the country was in a state of upheaval. There were enormous resistances in our community against the apartheid regime, a regime that incidentally had very strong ties with the Shah's Iran. I played a leading role in that struggle. Alhamdulillah, I think that I have been enormously privileged to see the connection between my Islam and the Quran and the practices of the Ahlul Bayt, and to make the connection between all of that and the real crucible of being a Muslim that was living amongst a large community that fell into the category of what the Quran and what the revolution in Iran had popularized calls the mustad'afuna fil ard. And so this was a rebellion of the mustad'afun, and I felt enormously privileged to have been able to play a leading role in that struggle. And alhamdulillah, I am recognized as one of the leaders of the country's liberation struggle. But more than just that, I could do that as a Muslim. I could do that on the basis of the Quran. I could do so based on the precedent of the Sahaba, on the precedent of the Imams, especially Imam Hussein. And the slogan, Kulla yawmin Ashura, Kulla ardin Karbala, that became a very common slogan inside the liberation struggle in South Africa for Muslims and for others. Notions of jihad, notions of istighbar, these became terms that were used in the ordinary days. And many of us, some of us in South Africa, we had many Shi'i role models. For many of us, Shariati was the go-to person, you know, for textual reading and for studies. Imam Khomeini's work wasn't translated significantly at that time. But I also do know that for other tendencies inside the liberation movement, for Qibla, for example, a very important organization that resisted apartheid, but with far more of an inspiration drawn from Iran. For Qibla, I mean, Imam Khomeini was a lodestar. Imam Khomeini was, you know, I don't want people to misunderstand what I'm saying, but in some ways, if a personal, not in the sense of a marja, but a lodestar, when a person becomes your Qibla, it has a different kind of meaning. But Imam Khomeini became the Qibla for this other group, who, by the way, was also called Qibla. But there was another very significant group, Al-Jihad. And Qibla didn't declare that they were Shias. Al-Jihad declared that they were Shias. And Al-Jihad played a very important role in the underground struggle. Now, the underground struggle was an armed struggle. Al-Jihad went underground. They played a significant role in the underground. And Ma'al Asaf, because they were Shias, and this was by agreement with the other liberatory formations, okay, they did not declare publicly that they were a Shia organization. And until today, not much has been written about the role of Al-Jihad. Not much has been written about the role of Al-Jihad. At some stage, I would really want to persuade one of my students to do a PhD that can become a book that gets published on the role of Al-Jihad. This very small Shia group, they're still alive. They still have their mosques and followers, but nothing has been written about the role of Al-Jihad in our country's liberation struggle. And so after much of the liberation struggle settled down, Mandela was released. I went to Birmingham. I did my PhD in Ulum al-Quran, which I also specialized in Pakistan. ثم بعد ذلك, I went to a Jesuit, a Catholic university in Germany. And I came back to South Africa.
Dissertation in Birmingham?
My dissertation was on how the South African Muslims during the liberation struggle, how they used the Quran as an ideological weapon in the liberation struggle. And I struggled to make tafsir sense of the appropriateness of how they were reading the Quran.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we'll discuss more about Quranic verses. And then in Germany, what you studied there?
In Germany, I did New Testament studies, typically called Injil studies. And I was curious about how the impact of the Enlightenment on biblical studies. And I was wondering, as modernity gets closer and closer to Muslims, and Muslim studies will invariably intersect with biblical studies, what the impact of that could be on Quranic studies. And when I finished that, I came back to South Africa. I taught at university, a senior lecturer in religion studies for 3 years. And then I was called to serve in the government. So I served as National Commissioner for Gender Equality, and I was appointed by President Mandela. And after that term of office for 5 years, I started taking the academy more seriously. But while I was doing my serious academic work, I've always been of the belief, in the Quran, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. So when you act and do, when you believe that a certain thing has to be done, based on the basis of your nas, then you have to do it. And while you're doing it, Allah will open more for you. And then you will understand more. And based on your more understanding, you have to act more. And the more you act, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا. So you have to make jihad. You have to work. And in your jihad, لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. You don't sit at your desk, sit at home, sit in your hawza all the time. You can, of course, say that this is an ilmi jihad, or that this is an ilmi ijtihad, and it's also that you can say, okay, that's fine. But for me, it meant go out, work with the mustad'afuna fil ard, work. Whether they are Muslims who for different reasons contracted the HIV virus, and and then ask, what does my Islam say about this? What does the Quran say about this? Imam Ali say about this? And the more you act on what you learn, the more you need to go back. So often, I mean, as you can imagine, sometimes people say I'm an academic masquerading as an activist. And at other times they say I'm an activist pretending to be an academic. La ilaha ulai wa la ilaha ulai mudabdab bayna dhalik. Of course, not in that Quranic sense. But this is who we are, you know. You never look at yourself and say, I am a scholar. Say I'm a student, but because you never reach the stage of ikmalul ilm or kamilul ilm, you never. You know, whenever you go into a library, oh gosh, I know so little, so many books I haven't read. And so my life has been
وما أوتيتم من العلم إلا قليلا وقل
إلا قليل. نعم, نعم. So my life has always been a cross between activism and now, I mean, my struggle now is what we call decoloniality. The fact that the qibla of the entire world is the global north. And if you take the global north and you make the analogy to say the Mecca of the Muslims, then the United States is the Kaaba of the Mecca in the contemporary world. So the global north is the Mecca of the entire world, really. And the Qibla of the entire world is Mecca. For example, if you want to write a book in Islam about Arabic, about Islam in English, if you get a publisher in Iran or a publisher in India, your book really isn't going to get far. With their distribution networks and so on, Amazon doesn't service Iran. So you decide to publish because you want your word to get out. You decide to publish in London or in New York. But the first thing that your publisher will look at, will this book sell in America? And they tell you this. So now you have an idea for a book. And it's your idea as a scholar. But in your head, you have to keep who's your audience. And so in the end, you write up a book meant for your Qibla, which is the global north and the United States. And your language changes, and your content changes, and you write for that audience. And more books about Islam come out for that audience. And the whole world starts thinking, that is Islam. An Islam that was tailor-made not for a Muslim audience, but for an audience out there who have their own questions. Tell us, please, about Islam and peace. Tell us, please, about moderate Islam. Can you give us advice on how to calm the Muslims down? These are the priorities of their empire. Many years ago, when they had occupied Afghanistan, or when the Soviets had occupied Afghanistan, they were in search of a moderate Islam to be produced by Muslims. And they funded, not moderate Islam. They wanted a jihadi to deal with the Soviets in Afghanistan. And they paid for Osama bin Laden, and they paid all these jihadis, and they funded all the books on jihad, and the alphabet, say, for example, K was for kafir, or K was for Kalashnikov. And this is how they were used in their school books, funded by the Americans and the Saudis. So they needed a jihad-defied Islam. When the Soviets left and they were then in charge, then they were in search of a moderate Islam. And now they're manufacturing a moderate Islam where Muslims are supposed to pretend that they are dead. They must just lie down, let all the forces of Taghut walk over them, and they must, yes, they can invade countries. There must be no opposition to them. They can occupy, they can destroy Muslim countries. They can continue to fund the people who are destroying Al-Aqsa and Al-Quds and Palestine, because the new Islam that they want is a moderate Islam, which they interpret as a dead Islam.
Professor Ishaq, in this context, I think now the field of Islamic studies, spiritual, Sufi, mystical studies is growing rapidly in the West, in Western academia and different universities. And many of the sincere Muslim thinkers and researchers are writing and teaching there in a proper form, which they represent real Islam or real Irfan or real Sufism also. I think in this context, you have your own critique on how these how this knowledge is growing in the Western context. I think you have something to say here, and then I'll ask you about your book and the goal of your book, so we can delve in some of its topics.
Okay, I think it is a tragedy because tasawwuf or irfan, it is primarily a method to fulfill the purpose of our creation. وَمَا خَلَقَتُ الْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. So the path of cleansing the heart, the struggle to reach closeness to Allah and to find a deeper meaning for that connection. This is why we were created for. We weren't created to fight wars. We weren't created to have mujadala and arguments, sectarian. We were created to worship God. But clearly what is happening is that God is being separated from the concerns of his people. An-nas iyal Allah. Huwa Rabbun Nas. So Allah, he exists in his own, but he also has relationships. And his deepest relationship is with those whose hearts are broken. Those who are Na'am, and they are mustad'afuna fil ard. This doesn't mean that God is not Rabbun Nas when his heart is with those whose heart are broken. And one of the major avenues that we know brings closeness to this God and develops a personal relationship with this God is the path of irfan. But what many are succeeding in doing, they talk about irfan, to know. But the God that they want you to know is a God that is disconnected from the makhluk. Because a God that is connected to the makhluk in a larger way, he also cares for the mustad'afun, and he has something to say about the mutrafun. So when you remove God from his people and you say, it's like, you're interested in a family, you say you're interested in a family, but you're really only interested in the family because there's a beautiful girl in the family. You're not interested in the family, my brother. Admit what your reasons are. Then I can understand and okay, but don't tell me that you're interested in the family. So then they come along and they say, we're interested in Islam, but they're only interested in one part of God's identity. That identity of God that can give calmness to their own heart, despite the hunger of my neighbor. And it is that kind of tasawwuf that is being cultivated in the West all the time. And I'm sorry, Hadi, I don't mean to these things, but earlier on in your comments when you said there are many scholars in the West, very good-hearted and so on, Hadi, many of these scholars in their works on tasawwuf, they're really good. And then when you read up a little bit about their part-time activities, then you see it is for United States institutions, not your academic institutions, but think tanks that meet to find how can tasawwuf or Sufism be instrumentalized in countries like Morocco. How do you build up the Sufis and strengthen the Sufis, which of course has very genuine roots in that country, unlike Al-Qaeda or unlike ISIS, Sufism has very genuine roots. But in the last 20 years, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they've come and also usurped the people's urf and adat. So now millions of dollars are being spent into creating a peculiar version of Irfan that is empire-friendly. And in the middle of this, the Muslim who is an enemy of the empire, an enemy of Tawhid, he then has to struggle on where he gets his own inspiration from. And so one comes to depend, on texts from Sahifa Sajjadiyya, and some of these have a general appeal to you, and some of them have a more specific appeal to me. I'm a bit of a strange junkie as an addict. I'm an addict of Dua Kmil. Dua Kmil, in a strange way, of course, I think all of us are entitled to say that we have a favorite verse of the Quran or a favorite ayah or something. The Dua Kmil is a strange thing for me. Hadi, this entire dua, from beginning to end, doesn't have, with two exceptions, it doesn't have a single word about the makhluk. Now, but you're talking about somebody like me, not the escapist Sufis. I'm talking about one of those people who is engaged with people all the time, okay? So I wouldn't always recommend this for everybody. But for me, who's busy with the ummah and family and students and. So this dua, it, with two exceptions, it doesn't have a single line. And at a slow reading, it's about 30 minutes. At a slow reading, it's about 40 minutes. And at a slow reading, it's about 40 minutes. At a fast reading, it's about 30 minutes. In the entire, from the beginning to the end, it doesn't have a single line, with two exceptions, which deals with the makhluk. It is entirely a wrestling between the abd and the khaliq and the rabb. It's a wrestling, it's a battle. Sometimes it's even holding God ransom. You promised me this, and now you see I'm in a mess, and the flames are all around me. And I had affirmed your unity. وَأَنَا عَبْدُكَ. You can hear me crying. Why aren't you doing anything? I'm in a mess. Why are you keeping quiet? And so it is an intense wrestling between you and God, except for two ayat, except for two texts. The one appears somewhere towards the end and the other one is right at the end. اللهم من أرادني بسوء فأرده ومن كادني فكده. And I felt very uncomfortable with it because I always thought, why should I make enemies gods? Somebody is my enemy, he deserves evil for me. اللهم من أرادني بسوء فأرده. Okay. ومن كادني فكده. So I felt very uncomfortable in the beginning reading this. Later on, I understood that the dua was a whole package deal. And so I have to read it. And later on, I reached my own interpretation. Allahumma man aradani bisu'in fa'aridhu. So the who was the ismul ishara towards the kid, not towards the shakhs. And وَمَنْ أَرَادَنِي بِسُوءٍ فَأَرِدْهُ يعني فَأَرِدْ سُوء. This is how I read it. But that's the one part. And then the other last part is وَصَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ وَالْأِمَّةَ الْمَيَامِينَ مِنْ آلِهِ وَسَلَّمَ تَسْلِيمًا كَثِيرًا كَثِيرًا. So here the Prophet comes in and the A'immah comes in, and that's it. So to come back to the point that you're making.
Just mention what's the most verse that touches you in whole Dua Kmil. Just we're talking about Dua Kmil, so a very spiritual verse or something that you feel very deeply with before you continue.
Sure. I don't know, 3 minutes into the dua, I start crying. And then I'm just at the mercy of God for the whole rest of the, and I don't know, but I try to leave myself out at the door when I sit down. Now, I also read the dua in jama'at, by the way, sometimes, at the mosque or at the musalla or yeah.
I mean, certain tawheedi or spiritual themes in the dua that you feel more with.
For me, the utter dependence on the transcendent. وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرْحًا. Farid, don't think you are a somebody. The strangulation of the ego. You are a somebody. You are a nothing. Don't fool yourself. And it teaches you humility. It teaches you to be gentle to other people. Because, there is going to be a day, and the flames of Jahannam are exploding all around you. And you are only dependent on the wasila and on God accepting the wasila. Nothing. So, but it's also a strong sense that I'm not alone in the world. I'm not alone in the world. And it's not in an arrogant way, where if the truth is with me, I will never fail. It's not in that kind of, which can lead to ideological arrogance also. But I promise you, the next time I read the dua, which is, I think, tomorrow night, the next time when I read it, I will try to think, but I never think about the whole. And the funny thing is, when I'm finished reading the dua, then there isn't space in my head for anything else or in my heart. And then there's the awkward thing where the imam adds another piece of dua. And then the imam speaks also. And I'm finished. I'm exhausted. I want to be home. I want to be alone. I want to be quiet. I want to let all the words that poured out of my heart settle in and get into my head also, so that the next week, when I prepare to come back next Thursday, that my a'mal, where it says, that my deeds and becomes wirdan wahida, that my deeds and my speech becomes. So next week when I come back, I'm less of a munafiq. I'm never going to stop being a munafiq. But next week when I come back, can I be a little bit less of a munafiq than what I was in the past week? We always go as munafiq. You come here the 1 week, you cry your heart out, and then, during the week you see this, you see that, and then you get up to all sorts of other stuff again.
حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها واحدة. Great. So, Doctor, you're insisting on a point which was in the context of your talk about Western Sufism, and then you talked about Dua Kmil, and then I think you were mentioning a point.
Yes. So basically, I was saying, so often, the sad thing is that the large trend of contemporary tasawwuf, especially in the West, it has little to do with the spirit of tasawwuf in early Islam, where the Sufis, often from time to time, they were in the forefront of standing up against injustices. Their zuhd wasn't only a zuhd in order to cleanse their hearts of materiality, but the zuhd was also a part of identification with the people who don't have. And that is why most of the early Sufis, they attracted all sorts of the poor amongst them. Anyway, over to you. I've rambled on enough for that topic.
And that's why our great A'immas of Ahl Bayt, or even the great Sufis like Ayn al-Qudha or Hallaj, or even Sahrawardi, they were killed and oppressed, and they were kept into prisons, especially all the A'immas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Unfortunately, I think there were a few cases where scholars were these things, but in general, the Sunni tradition had always supported what I describe in my book as accommodationism, or what could be described as status quoism, that you have to aqidatan, you have to support stability above the quest for justice. I mean, they would, for example, argue that a single day of protests and rebellion is worse than 100 years of oppression. Now, with that kind of theology, there is no ways for the mustad'afuna fil ard to resist.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you apply that logic, Bani Israel should have remained in Israel. They should not have complained. Forget about asking and begging Moses, Nabi Musa, to have them led out. The Prophet ﷺ should not have complained in Makkah. Forget about going to Medina and planning then to overthrow the rulers of Makkah, let alone the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Let alone that. Ibrahim should never have gone to his father and questioned his father about the gods that his father worshipped. Worse, he went and he slayed the heads of these gods when his family was gone one day. This is irhab, according to the ulama of associationism, the ulama of accommodation.
And this is all related to a very deep discussion about Aqidat al-Jabr and the role of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and how they built it in societies, and all the bad things that we face until now because of the Aqidat al-Jabr. And oppressors always believe in this aqidah just to keep the people quiet. And okay, Doctor, I think it's very interesting to go to discuss some of the topics of your book. So what's the goal of this book in the beginning? Or let us go, because the main thing I think that you managed to present in this book is you mentioned that the current using of the terms Iman, Islam, and Kufr ignore some of the aspects which are rooted in the early meanings. Thus, such terms, Muslim and Kafir, cannot by any way refer to social or geographical identities or places which different people were born in, and thus they received such names or descriptions. And then you use the ideas of Ibn Arabi and Allama Tabatabai and Rashid Rida and Izutsu also, and his semantic and linguistic understanding of the term Iman, and use the term Iman, not the term belief. So please explain to us the importance of what you're doing here until we reach to the concept of pluralism and the concept of liberation. But let us start point by point.
Very briefly. Many of the basic words that we have meant something at some stage, meant something that was connected to its literal meaning. The term Iman, for example, it is to have conviction. But the Quran also tells the Arab, who were a part of the Muslim community, don't say, Amanna, bal qulu aslamna. So the Prophet is instructed to make a distinction between the mu'minin and the Muslimin. Okay. So the Prophet is asked to remember the etymological roots of these words and what do these words actually mean. Right. And when you ignore the etymological roots as we do today, then it becomes a whole different. So of course we have aqidah, but it's also possible for a man to live somewhere. He grew up in a Muslim family, has never admitted publicly to any of the creeds of Islam, and we still treat him as a Muslim. And then you have somebody, or let's say Saddam Hussein, and lives of criminality against the Ummah. And they are regarded as Muslims. Is it just a label that you put onto somebody? Like, you can have these, I don't wear labeled clothes. Brands, right. So I can buy a brand and I can put the brand on here. And will people seriously, they know that I can't afford this money. They know that it's fake, it's these things. Will people take me seriously? No, and you don't need intelligence to know it's a fake brand. But Muslims use the word and we know it's a fake brand in relation to so many people whose private and public lives are visible for us. It's visible. When you go to their palaces, it's visible. When they go to France, their lives are visible. When it's so it's both a theological exploration of the terms Iman, Islam, and Muslim, and Kafir, and so on. But it's also an invitation to look, my brother, are all of these people that we describe as Kafir, that we put in a Kafir label on, are all of them equal? Is Donald Trump at the same level of kufr as Hugo Chavez? Was Mandela at the same level of kufr as Ronald Reagan? How do you get to this? Is there no ethical dimension to our ways of describing people? And so in many ways, you have all of these people walking around with these fake brands. And the ones with the fake brands, they make the loudest. And that is why, many of these these ISIS types and these Al-Qaeda types, they're all walking around with fake brands, and they're making the biggest claims on representing the genuine brand. But because we don't want to have arguments about brands amongst us, خلي اتركوهم فليكون مسلمين لو يريدون. This is our game.
Great.
And they're damaging us, our lives, our appearances, our properties, our images. Now,
we'll delve more in the theory, because I think to understand your theory, we need to discuss it more in depth. So, in the meaning of Iman, you talk about the relation between the term Iman and Amin and Amana. So it's an act of the heart to live peace and security. And then you say in the Islamic theology, Ilm al-Kalam, Iman has variously been defined as one or more of the following: affirmation, verbal testimony, belief, or righteous conduct. So معرفة and إقرار, as if it is separated from the heart and أحوال. So there is a kind of separation between the intellect and the heart, the عقيدة and أخلاق, where the Quranic Iman is different. It's filled with أخلاق and الأعمال الصالحة. الأعمال الصالحة with Iman.
نعم.
And then you read this ayah, indeed the mu'mineen, which is the ayah, indeed the mu'minun are those whose hearts tremble with awe whenever God is mentioned, and whose Iman is strengthened whenever his ayat are conveyed unto them, and who place their trust in their sustainer, those who are constant in prayer and spend on others out of what we provide for them as sustenance. It is they who are truly the mu'minun. So you concentrate too much on this ayah, and you connect the real meaning of Iman with the good acts and the good behaviors. So just summarize the theory that you're talking about here.
The location of Iman is often, but it's like saying, my speech comes from my throat and my lips and my tongue, but it only emerges from there. What is my speech is what is heard and received, and that goes out there. So the seat of Iman may be the heart, and of course not the physical heart, the other part of the heart. But what Iman really is, it's of no value if it stays in the seat. Iman really is the expression, and the expression is your a'mal. So it is the same thing and yet not the same thing. It can be here and it can be entirely dead if you don't care for your neighbors, if you don't do your prayers, and if you don't do what God requires from you and struggle to stay away from God, what God has made naha anhum. So Iman, when it becomes alive, and the utterances and the feelings and the voice structures that exist in your head and in your heart, it comes out as sound that impacts on people for better or for worse. That is your Iman and your lack of Iman. And so the relationship between Iman and Amal that the Quran emphasizes so much, it's not two separate things that you have to struggle to connect. It is the one that has to be given life to. But without life, it is doubtful if it can be called Iman. If I have all these gifts in me, and you can't hear me, and I don't make sounds, I don't know if you can describe me as somebody who can speak. As a speaker, I have the faculties, but I've done nothing to articulate ownership of the faculties. So to be a mu'min is both to have it, but above all, to articulate it through a'mal al-salih.
Great. And Doctor, now we'll talk then about this definition of Iman, and it can be applicable to Jews and Christians and all other peoples. We'll reach to this point, but before that,
so you're going to make sure that we're going to get into the point where I get into trouble. You are determined.
So you mentioned some Urafa like Ibn Arabi and Allama Tabatabai. They talk about the increase in Iman. or they talk about علم, يقين, طمأنينة, شهود, or they talk about إيمان and يقين. I like the definition you mentioned about علامة طباطبائي about إيمان, where he says the light of إيمان radiates gradually upon the heart, and this continues intensely until it reaches perfection. Iman then continues to increase and grows firm until it reaches to the stage of certitude, which is yaqeen. We have this ayah that وَمَا يُؤْمِنُ أَكْثَرُهُم بِاللَّهِ إِلَّا وَهُم مُشْرِكُونَ. So we have some parts of shirk inside our hearts, some parts of iman. People are like this unless they are ma'sumin. And here, if you can also, I wanted to ask you, what is the importance of the study that Ízótso presented in his valuable book, the Iman and Akhlaq in the Quran? So how he presented a value-added understanding of Iman, which was one of his creative approaches to Quran.
Right. So the one is, an approach where, of course, I agree with Allama Tabatabai, that Iman is not something, like this, that here we go, you have this. And then it stays the same all the time. If you look after it, it stays the same. And then I can give it back to you after 100 years and it will still be the same. The Quran speaks about وَزَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا, that Iman increases and so on. And then there are those other texts and even hadith, that speaks about you will go to bed as a Muslim and you will wake up as a kafir. What about this? And other ayah that you had quoted. So Iman is something that, as Allama Tabai says, that radiates upon your heart and ennobles your heart, and it makes your heart brighter. And the effect of what he's saying is that your life becomes brighter. So not only does your life become brighter and lighter for you to carry as you walk around, and less burdens, emotional burdens, psychological burdens, and so on, spiritual burdens, it becomes lighter, and there's more light in the sense of nur. So the nur increases. I do not agree with Allama Tabatabai when he says until it reaches perfection. I do not believe that this light reaches perfection in ordinary people. The Quran says, وَأَكْثَرُهُمْ. Okay, not sure what is meant by أَكْثَرُهُمْ, but clearly not all. Right.
So very few people will reach the
very few people remain mushrikun. Yes, okay. Okay, right. But the idea that ordinary human beings can be perfected in their life, I am not convinced of that one. Ordinary human beings, there's another verse in the Quran, فَاعْبُدُوا رَبَّكَ حَتَّى أَتَاكَ الْيَقِينَ. So at some level, you can say that I have intellectual certainty about the oneness of God and the onlyness of God. كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ. I have certainty. I don't have a single intellectual doubt. And at another level, we are human beings. And so when the Quran says, فَاعْبُدُوا رَبَّكَ حَتَّى أَتَاكَ الْيَقِينَ, it says, worship your God until the moment that you die, until the last moment in your life. So I don't aspire towards absolute certainty. I do believe, I'm firm about my beliefs, and I struggle to become a better person. Sometimes it's one step forward, two steps backwards. But I do believe that this complete yaqeen is the domain of a small group of people.
Which also the Quran says it's awliya or siddiqeen or salihin, which are very few. Dr. Here you continue in your book talking about the Iman in God, which implies commitment to the dignity and freedom of the people and sacrifice. And you mentioned certain incidences where Jews and Christians show such rightness in their acts. Thus, we have to acknowledge that there is mu'mineen outside the Muhammadan community. And it's a very important point that you mentioned here. It will open the door about talking about religious pluralism. An interesting point that you also mentioned, when a whole tribe converted to Islam in the Prophet's time, by way of a treaty with Muhammad, we must understand this treaty in terms of Arab Bedouin cultural practices. Therefore, this practice may not have meant the same thing for all members of the tribe, and the name Muslim could well have been a new identity of treaty rather than of faith. You mentioned just a minute ago about this idea. It's not about your identity and label and brand. Okay, you may have the name, but you don't have the reality of it. But the reality of faith, which is rightness, which is sacrifice, which is faith in God, which can be manifested in other people of other faiths also. How you consider this idea?
I mean, Muslims have a history of takfir. It's not a new thing that came along with ISIS or with Al-Qaeda. It's a very old thing in our theological history. But to actually go around saying that another person who identifies with another community, that he is a Muslim, that one is a much more difficult one for Muslims to accept. Now, you can ask that Muslim, okay, so Mandela, he was a kafir. حبطت أعمالهم في الدنيا والآخرة في نار جهنم خالدين فيها. But there were thousands of you who attended his funeral. There were okay. I have my own issues with the Dalai Lama, who's often been able to be quite an ally of America. I mean, I have a lot of personal love and respect for him. I've met him several times. We spent a lot of wonderful times together. But even the Dalai Lama, a very gentle soul. Are you saying that mushrik who accompanied the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Abu Bakr into the cave and guided them out of Mecca on the Hijrah, that mushrik is in the same position as the mushrikun who were chasing him, that mushrik will not attain to salvation for his support? When Muhammad went to Taif and he wanted to preach to the people of Taif, they stoned him, they pelted him with stones, he was covered in blood, and he sought refuge in the garden of Utbah bin Rabi'ah. And Utbah bin Rabi'ah was not a Muslim. Utbah escorted him back to Mecca, where they were waiting to punish him, to kill him for treachery, having gone to speak to the leaders of Taif. Utbah bin Rabi'ah was a tribal leader, but he was a mushrik. And he announced that Muhammad is walking with me under my protection. If you kill Muhammad or do anything to him, my tribe will wage war against you. So is Utbah bin Rabi'ah in the same stage as Abu Sufyan? For Sunnis, of course, who don't believe that Sayyidina Ali, Sayyidina Abu Talib was a Muslim. Oh, this man, in the year of his death, which was known as Am al-Huzn, the year of grief, such an impact it had on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he dies. For the Prophet, it is the year of grief, Am al-Huzn. And you telling me that this man will go to hell because he's not a Muslim. So the larger question is, it's a question of belief, but it's also a question of serious ethics. So basically, in a roundabout way, I want to say, look, people, if Iman and Amal are so intrinsically intertwined, we simply have to go beyond these barriers, beyond the simplicity of fake labels and genuine labels, and see what do we really see. A person with a fake label can exude a wonderful personality and good akhlaq and can be a good believer. And a person with a genuine label can be the most corrupt person on the face of the earth.
You reminded me of the definition of Islam that Ayn al-Qudha al-Hamadani uses also, which also can be implied through different people of different religious identities. And here you also talk about kufr as the opposite side of Iman. You mention about Cantwell Smith when he says Islam and kufr in traditional Arabic and their early acceptance in Muslim conviction was something much more vibrant, searching and transporting. He also argues that while it is clear that the words Islam and Deen could conjure up the idea of Islam as a reified entity, one religion among others, this way by no means is the only and indeed not even the primary interpretation. So there is an interpretation very much wider than only a certain identity about Islam. Islam is a reality that can exist in human being hearts, which is interesting. And in talking about kufr, you talk about this ayah. So kufr, so the opposite of Iman is not necessarily all the mushrikeen, but the kafirin, there is something, نحن نقول أمر وجودي, they're doing something. So no. You mentioned this ayah, إن الذين يكفرون بآيات الله ويقتلون النبيين بغير حق. And يقتلون, you mentioned أنهم يواجهون ويعترضون ويجحدون. ويقتلون الذين يأمرون بالقسط من الناس فبشرهم بعذاب أليم. So this verse talks about kufr as an active attitude of individuals, not a socio-religious and often ethnic identity of a group, which will give us a new understanding about terms. So we have to redefine the terms. So if you have something to comment here.
When you were talking now, I thought, oh gosh, this guy really articulates things very well. I wonder if he offers any kind of courses that I could come and study under him, or what will it be like, to have him as a teacher. So, and now you're asking me, but I was thinking this while you were talking. It's difficult because the world is organized along the lines of tribes. But if you look at the words, and sometimes even the logical conclusion of the colonization of God. I'm busy writing a chapter at the moment on Zionism and the colonization of God. And this is really when you reduce God to your national entity, your country's mascot, or your soccer team's mascot, where you make dua, Allah must give us victory on the soccer field tomorrow, or on the cricket field tomorrow, because Pakistan is playing India, and he must give us victories over these Hindus, despite the fact that there are Muslims in the Indian side also. So this is a kind of shirk, to reduce God to the mascot of your ethnic entity or your religio entity, when your religio entity had become the entity of a group to the exclusion of their ethics and their deep aqidah and the relationship between the aqidah and the ethics. It's easy, you put it on your flag and two swords. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. So you've got it on your flag. This is, of course, the sha'r of our watan. Or you say, Allah, Watan al-Malik. As you reach Morocco from Spain, you see this carved on the mountains, Okay. So in the middle of your own wataniya or your own deen, even because deen has got nothing to do with the Arabic word deen. Deen is a cult, a religion, like the Jews have made Judaism a religion, and then, you know, God is always on your side.
نحن أبناء الله وأحباؤه. That kind of religion.
No. But you reduce your own people to a tribe instead of an ethical community.
Even Dr. Ibn Arabi, in his very deep Irfani theory, he also talks about this idea when he talks about God in beliefs, that a person should go beyond the limitations of the God on belief to understand and recognize the real God in his path towards him. Yeah, so I'm sorry, so maybe you were mentioning a point. So going back to Izozo, he also adds that the core or the essence of the term kufr, the semantic structure of it is not unbelief, but rather ingratitude or unthankfulness. So he talks about this idea.
Naam. It is not, I believe that there are 3 books on Farid's desk. And the other one says, no, I don't believe that that is a book. That is too small to be classified as a book. That is a booklet. So there are 2.5 books. So the argument is, do you have 3 books or do you have 2.5 books? And then we have a debate on this book as a half. No, it's not as simple as something rational like this. Izozo draws our attention to how Iman is something beyond the rational, but also is not anti-rational or irrational. But the other thing about Izozo, look, you know, if you were to ask me to recommend you 2 books on the Quran, the one book that I will recommend is Izotsu's Ethico-Religious Concepts in the Quran. And the other book that I would recommend is Michael Selz's Towards Understanding the Quran. Michael Selz's book is an amazing book. It's in some ways easy to read and in some ways difficult to read. When you read Michael Selz's book, you develop a new understanding. Yay, the Quran's words don't only contain meaning. The talaffuz, the expression, the tilawat, also carries meaning. How does the Quran speak to your heart? And it's actually, the book comes with kind of exercises, you know, it's not an easy, you need to take off an hour to listen to a short surah and get, you know, into it and close your eyes and then read the text and then see how the different ozan, the wazns, you know, compare with, but it's an amazing book. But here again, both Michael Selz and Izozo, who are among the people who wrote the finest books on the Quran, and really, for people who have doubts about the Quran, intellectual doubts, read these 2 books.
Great.
Read these 2 books. But again, these 2 people, أنا لا أعرف هل كان مسلمان أم لا. أنا لا أدري. أعرف مايكل سيلز وما سألته مرة هل أنت مسلم أم لا. It feels like so nearly insulting. You know, Izozo, I think, has passed away. I'm convinced that Izozo was Muslims, but I don't know. And
the new definition of Islam that you present, not necessarily in the Islam of identity that we know.
Yes, but to be in a state of, and you can't say, you know, Aslamtu in the past. I'm continuously submitting. I go to the shop, there's nobody around me that sees me and so on. I really wonder how pork tastes. My family's gone at the moment. No. That's a new act of Islam. It's another act of, I see an elderly person on the road. Can I help her carry a bag? Aslamtu. It is time for Salah, and I haven't finished my earlier ones and so on. Am I now going to just continue watching this news, or do I wait, you know, I have to? Aslamtu. So it's a life of submission. And it's a life of struggling with our Iman. struggling to increase it, struggling to preserve it. And it's not easy, ya habibi. It's very, very difficult.
Professor Ishaq, I'll just mention some of the other points that you talk about in the book, just to reach to some of the final questions about pluralism. So you also mentioned that the Quran makes it clear that Ahlul Kitab shouldn't be generalized and they should be understood in the correct context, because there were certain historic and social groups only which Quran meant. So the Quran makes it clear that it was the rejection and ignorance of Tawheed that had led to social and economic oppression in Meccan society, associated with elite wealthy groups. So when Quran criticized such groups, also Ahl al-Kitab, these attributes were taken into consideration in the first place. So Quran criticized tribal exclusivism that enabled Jews to treat people outside their community, especially the weak and vulnerable, with contempt, hatred, and oppression. The contempt for other people, the Quran suggests, was very much rooted in notions of being the chosen of God. نحن أبناء الله وأحباؤه. And they said, وقالوا لن تمسنا النار إلا أياما معدودة وقالوا لن يدخل الجنة إلا من كان هودا أو نصارى تلك أمانيهم. So you mention all these very nice ideas and theories there, and then you talk very precisely, and I think you have very new conclusions about the idea of pluralism. When you mention this ayah, إن الذين آمنوا والذين هادوا والنصارى والصابئين من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر وعمل صالحا فلهم أجرهم عند ربهم ولا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون. You mentioned ideas of رضا and طبطبائي. So here let us talk specifically about this ayah, which is كل أمة لكل أمة جعلنا منسكا هم ناسكوه فلا ينازعنك في الأمر وادع إلى ربك إنك لعلى هدى. If you would present the interesting interpretation of this ayah.
So you see, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, he indeed came as rahmatan lil alamin. The Quran indeed came as Furqan and Hudan. Islam presented itself as the best option for humankind. But the Quran did not demand that this option, Islam, that the Quranic Islam, that this option must be operationalized, must be united in a certain group. There was an ummah, but bear in mind that this ummah, in the mithaq of Medina, this ummah includes the Jews and the Christians. In the Quran, for example, as Allah says, Ya ayyuha ar-rusul, kulu min tayyibat, wa'malu salihat, wa inna hadhihi ummatukum ummatan wahida. So he speaks to prophets, and he says that their ummah is a single ummah. So clearly, if you privilege the ethical religio identity of people, then the sociological label is inconsequential. You're looking at the Quranic way of addressing people. Ya Ahl al-Kitab. Okay. And then this is the text. Then you see,
I don't want to interrupt you, but even we have the ayat وَمِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ مَنْ إِنْ تَأْمَنْهُ بِقَنْطَارٍ يُؤَدِّهِ إِلَيْكَ لَيْسُوا سَوَاءً مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ أُمَّةٌ
لَيْسُوا سَوَاءً. So it is quite simple, this Quranic principle, لَيْسُوا سَوَاءً. So the Zionists in Israel, who are bombing our brothers and sisters, our Muslims and Christian brothers and sisters, and the other Jews who are rising up in South Africa against Israel, and who are rising up in the United States against Israel, you can't say they're the same. This is the crime of Christianity, that blood, that evil flows in the blood of people, or good flows in the blood of people. So this that all the Jews must inherit the evil of all the Jews before Bani Israel. There are, of course, exceptions to this. I mean, exceptions in the case of, say, royalty, or exceptions in the case of imama, or even in, say, Nabi's offspring. Yeah. So there are exceptions, but the general rule is that good does not flow in the blood of people. So you can't praise the Muslims for what was done by Muhammad and his ummah when we resemble nothing of that sort. And you can't blame the Jews for what was done in the time of the Prophet. You blame the Jews of Israel and the other Zionists for what they've done throughout the world. And you also acknowledge the Jews who are participating in the Palestinian liberation struggle and who refuse to accept that their religion must be a religion of oppression. So Muslims would have to come to terms with the idea that there are many, many Muslims, okay, will be gentle towards some of them. An ordinary Muslim who is just a wine drinker, I'll be gentle towards him. Another Muslim who sells out the entire Muslim ummah and is waging war against other Muslim countries, I will not be gentle towards him. I will not, in my language, ascribe to him the identification of Muslim. I will even go so far, and I'm not talking theologically, kal mujtahid, I will accuse him of kufr. I will not exclude somebody from the label Muslim because he doesn't have the label. On the contrary, I will say that in terms of Islam, the value system of Islam, the demands of the Quran, there is far more visible in the life of that person than in the life of other Muslims. And so when the person passes away, I will go to his funeral, I will make dua for him, I will say marhum or Allahu yarhamuhu, and I will make dua that Allah admits him into his Jannatul Firdaus.
Great. Professor Ishaq, regarding this ayah, لكل جعلنا منكم شرعة ومنهاجا ولو شاء الله لجعلكم أمة واحدة ولكن ليبلوكم فيما آتاكم فاستبقوا الخيرات إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم فيه تختلفون. So some would say that these verses or this verse addresses the communities of earlier prophets only. So it's not applicable for our time. Now there is Islam only, which abrogated all the past Sharia. And I think you have an interesting answer here that insists on بما كانوا فيه يختلفون and فاستبقوا الخيرات. So what's your idea?
So if that was just for that ummah, it could have gone into hadith and not into the Quran, I mean, look, the general pattern amongst our ulama, mal asaf, has been to gradually narrow the meaning of who is us, and to gradually broaden the boundaries of who is not us. So this kind of hermeneutical tactic, it's not, it's like, this one ayah in Surah Fatiha, La ikraha fi din.
Sorry, in Baqarah, yeah.
La ikraha fi din. Okay. So the ayah is clear. Sarahatan, no, la ikraha fi din. And throughout our tradition, our ulama come along and give it an opposite meaning. لا إكراه يعني في دخول الدين. So if you leave it at لا إكراه في الدين, then you are free to choose your religion at any stage in your life. But no, they put in khuruj in every tafsir, dukhul. In every tafsir you find they put in dukhul to give it a completely opposite meaning. And this is just bewildering, يحرفون الكلمة عن مواضعه. It's more an example of that.
Okay, Doctor, I think also this ayah is related. لكل وجهة هو موليها فاستبقوا الخيرات. So compete with one another in righteous deeds, because people they have different wujuhat, for example. You have something to comment here also?
Absolutely. If there is anything, then it is the question of, and it's not for us to determine who are the winners, by the way, because that can lead to another triumphalism, you know. We are meant to compete with each other in good deeds. And God will inform us about whose deeds were the better. And God will inform us about who was ahaq, who was closer to the truth. But our responsibility is two things. The one is to compete against our own nafs. You have to compete against yourself. You have to do better today than what you did yesterday. And there are these different communities. Can we engage in this competing in good deeds? For example, in South Africa, the two dominant, by far, welfare or emergency assistance groups are Muslim groups. The one huge national group, by far the most famous in the country, gets the most media on national TV, is the Gift of the Givers, Waqful Waqifin. And then there is the Islamic Relief Fund. And then way after that, very far after that, comes a small Jewish fund. And then after that, tiny groups of Christians. And Muslims are less than 2% of the country's population. But we have large and many trucks, we have helicopters, we have planes. Gift of the Givers was doing all the transportation of the gas tanks for COVID. It rebuilt hospitals. It's as famous as the government. And many people are saying, let us pay our tax to Gift of the Givers. So this is how, and now, you know, you should have Christian agencies coming up and saying, why not us? If these people can do all of this, why not us? But in general, Christians give their money to Gift of the Givers, okay? So, but it is both a competition with communities, but above all, it is a competition within ourselves against the self, the nafs of yesterday, the nafs of this morning.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Doctor, you mentioned a commentary of Rashid Rida on this ayah, and if God had pleased, He would have made you a single ummah. However, He desires to try you in what He gave you, so vie with one another in righteous deeds. Where He says, what is wrong with you? That you look at deen in terms of what divides and disperses, ignoring the wisdom of diversity and the objectives of deen and sharia. Isn't this a departure from guidance and pursuing your own fancy? You have to make the shari'as or the shara'i'as a cause of competition in goodness, not a cause for enmity and competing in prejudice. I think you mentioned about this idea, but it's interesting that people such as Rida, they have this very wide...
They had seen this earlier. They had seen this much earlier, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and so many Muslims think that these are novel ideas and so on, but no. In our own traditions, many people had discussed these earlier, and sadly, people are often punished for these views.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Also, this ayah, I think it's important. You mentioned it. That is a community that is bygone. تلك أمة قد خلت. To them belongs what they earned, and to you belong.
ما كسبت ولكم ما كسبتم.
So there is no reason to suppose that this should be not applied to the post-Muhammadan Muslim community. It's the same thing.
No.
Yeah. No. So if you have something to mention here.
So this idea, that we will be rewarded for what others had done before us, and therefore we don't have to be as good Muslims. No. You will get كل يعمل على شاكلته ومن يعمل مثقال ذرة خيرا يره ومن يعمل مثقال ذرة شر يره. So it's us. You don't come, with لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت. تلك أمة قد خلت. They are people who've gone. What are you coming with? You don't come and tell me what your father did, how many students your father had, what a well-known, respected alim or a zahidi was.
ليس الفتى من قال أنا ابن من، إنما الفتى من قال ها أنا ذا. So, Doctor, also here you talk about pluralism and its relation to liberation, and you talk too much about this, and you have an example here in Africa, which you referred to, where the Muslims, Jews, and the Christians, they united against oppression. And I think here it's very interesting, and you mentioned in one of your lectures that Imam Khomeini's creativity in using such terms of mustad'afin versus mustakbirin, which is a reality, mustad'afin, that can unite all different people of different religions and ethnicities on the truth, ala al-haq, against all the other people. So the division that we have, it's not a division of religions, it's a division on the, what we can say, al-qiyam wal-mabadi' al-haqiqiyya.
Now, and this is why Iran, in a country like South Africa, and in a country like Venezuela and Cuba and so on, Iran enjoys an enormous prestige. Iran is not a country where if you mention it, then people, oh, I don't want to get into trouble here, I don't want to get into trouble there. No, on the contrary. Our country's foreign policy has made it clear. We have dealings with the Iranians, we support the Iranians. And my son was in Venezuela recently, and he spoke there of the high esteem that Iran is held in Venezuela. And this is precisely because Imam Khomeini introduced, well, the left had elements of it in what they called progressive internationalism. But Imam Khomeini, in the popularization of terms such as the mustakbirin and the mutrafin and the mustad'afun, these words were there, and they were there in the Quran. But we were not alive to them. He brought them to us. It was his use of it and his popularization of his use of it and the adoption of these terms by the Islamic Revolution in Iran that popularized them amongst Muslims. And now they form an integral part of the entire discourse of Islamic liberation theology, much of which I dealt with in this book that you've been referring to. I just grabbed it off from the shelf next to me.
Great. Professor Ishaq, thank you for all the knowledge you shared. The ayah in the Quran, which I also read its tafsir from your book, Inna akramakum inda Allahi atqakum, where you say it applies for all human beings. At-taqwa is a sifa that anybody can gain. So in talking about Sufism, Irfan, in talking about the negative sides of the Western colonialism or the الغزو الثقافي الغربي أو القيم الاستكبارية أو الرأسمالية السيئة. We mentioned many ideas. We talked about your book, Quran and pluralism, Quran and respecting, redefining terms such as Islam and kufr, which is a very deep study that you presented. So if you'd like to summarize or conclude or mention the final point.
No, I've spoken too much. At least in one of the things they teach us in Irfan is qillat al-kalam. And now I feel embarrassed that I've spoken so much.
Unless you're sharing very nice and knowledge and light to other people and insight.
I hope so, inshallah. We do what we can. And above all, we pray that Allah gives us the hidayah to make amal on what we know.